Hey guys, tonight we're headed somewhere grand, mythical, and probably a little dangerous if you have vertigo. We're time traveling straight into ancient Greece. Welcome to Olympia. You've just wandered off a dusty trail, your sandals caked with dry olive mud, and there it is up ahead, a massive temple rising from a bed of cypress and stone. It's quiet, almost too quiet, and yet something in the air hums like distant thunder wrapped in incense. The Temple of Zeus. It stands tall and unbothered, about 20 meters high, with rows and rows of columns that look like stone soldiers frozen mid-march. You pause at the entrance, squinting upward like someone just dropped you in the middle of a movie set with zero context. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how far this little bedtime journey travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside the temple. The floor beneath you is marble cool, smooth, and slightly too clean for a place that's technically 400 years old. The columns surround you like giants in a trance, each one etched with delicate spirals and patterns that practically whisper, "Yes, I took decades to carve. You're welcome." But the real showstopper? He's right in front of you. Zeus. He's sitting there. Not just sitting reigning, watching, waiting, and somehow, not in a creepy way. He's 13 meters tall, which means if you stood on someone's shoulders, on top of a chariot, on top of a goat, you still wouldn't reach his knee. Legend says he's seated because if he stood up, the whole temple would shatter. Casual power move. In his right hand, there's a scepter topped with a golden eagle classic Zeus. In his left, a figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, who's literally the size of a full-grown adult. That's right, his jewelry has its own personality. The entire statue is a masterpiece of ivory and gold. His skin, thinly layered ivory panels fitted together so precisely they look alive. His robes, sheets of hammered gold, gleaming like sunlight poured into fabric form. The throne itself, made of ebony and decorated with gems, mythological creatures, and probably a healthy dose of artistic flexing. Historians still argue about how he really looked. Was he smiling, frowning, looking mildly disappointed like a Greek dad during a chariot race? Nobody knows for sure. Some say his expression changed depending on who was looking, which, okay, if the statue was an ancient AI, that would actually track. Around you, pilgrims are kneeling. Some whisper, some just stare. One guy has tears running down his cheeks, though it's unclear if that's religious awe or just severe neck strain. You try to imagine how they built this. No cranes, no lasers, just human hands, human tools, and an insane level of patience. This isn't just art, it's belief carved in stone and bone, shaped with gold and purpose. You start to understand the statue isn't just a decoration. It's the centerpiece of a civilization's imagination, a literal and symbolic axis around which power, piety, and prestige rotated. Tonight, you're standing in a place where myth felt more real than gravity. And Zeus, he's still watching. You keep your eyes on Zeus. Honestly, it's hard to look away. The sheer size of him is overwhelming, but there's also something about the details, those impossibly intricate curls in his beard, the gentle folds in his golden robe, the way his gaze seems to hover just above your head, like he's watching something far beyond you. You blink. This thing didn't just appear one day like a surprise drop. Somebody made it. Or, more accurately, someone pulled off the impossible. His name? Phidias. You might have heard of him before. Sculptor of gods, artistic legend, and quite possibly the kind of guy who'd measure a pebble 5 times before placing it. The dude was meticulous. If Michelangelo had a Greek uncle, it'd be Phidias. Let's rewind a little. Around the 430s BCE, Olympia was booming. Religious festivals, athletic competitions, political deals disguised as prayer sit was like ancient Instagram, only dustier. And the Temple of Zeus, that was the centerpiece. But the temple felt empty. Grand? Yes. Imposing? Definitely. But the people wanted presence. So The city hired Phidias, already famous for his work on the Parthenon's Athena statuette, Make Something Divine. His mission: make a statue of Zeus that made people feel small, humble, and a little bit terrified. In a holy way. And so Phidias got to work. You wander around the edge of the temple floor, imagining the scene over 2,000 years ago. Carpenters setting up scaffolding that creaked with every breeze. Apprentices carrying buckets of melted gold, probably praying not to spill a drop. And Phidias himself, hovering like a hawk, every motion slow, deliberate. They didn't carve the statue from a single block like some oversized marble popsicle. No, this was a layered marvel. A wooden frame for structure, sheets of ivory for skin, and golden panels for the robes and accessories. Kind of like divine, cosplay only, permanent. Want a fun fact? They didn't have glue. Instead, they used dowels, pegs, and this slightly terrifying process of heating and shaping ivory so it would mold around the wooden base, like wrapping a skeleton in luxury. And yes, there were rumors Phidias added his own face to some part of the statue, maybe in the curls, maybe hidden in the folds of Zeus's robe. Classic artist move, right? Hide a little selfie inside the greatest thing you ever made. And the statue worked. The moment it was unveiled, people cried. Actual tears. Grown adults fell to their knees. One ancient writer said it made him feel like he finally understood the gods not through logic, but through awe. That's kind of the point, isn't it? When you walk into that temple, you don't just see Zeus, you feel Zeus. And that's not just the work of a god. That's the work of a genius with chisels, gold, and a frankly concerning level of attention to symmetry. Historians are still baffled at how they pulled it off. Like, how did they get the ivory? How did they mold it? And how did they even climb up to assemble the top parts without falling into a vat of molten gold? Academic debates continue. Some scholars think Phidias developed specialized tools. Others believe he trained a team of ivory experts. A few think he might have made deals with trade networks that stretched far beyond Greece, maybe even into Africa or India. No one really knows. You walk a little closer to the base of the statue now. You imagine the smell-hot wax, old wood, and that faint tang of metal from bronze inlays. You can almost hear the sounds of a workshop echoing through time. Hammer taps, quiet muttering, the occasional shouted curse when something didn't line up. And above it all, Phidias, probably with clay on his hands and 10 deadlines burning behind his eyes. You can't help but respect it. This wasn't just religious devotion, it was engineering, art, and ambition, all fused into one glorious, oversized, holy masterpiece. And for one flickering moment, as your eyes trace the edge of Zeus's golden sandal, you swear you see Phidias smirk in the shadows. You step back, your neck finally getting a break from all the upward staring. And as the light shifts through the temple's stone rafters, you start to wonder why here. Why Olympia? Why did Zeus, king of all Greek gods, get his mega throne set up in this quiet little valley, instead of, say, Athens or Mount Olympus itself? Well, welcome to the ancient Greek version of location, location, location. Olympia wasn't just any random hillside. It was sacred ground long before Zeus's statue ever towered here. People had been gathering on this patch of land for centuries, praying, competing, feasting, arguing about politics disguised as theology. Classic. By the time Phidias showed up with his golden blueprints, Olympia was already a legend in motion. You walk out of the temple into the dusty brightness, blinking as your eyes adjust. The scent of pine floats in on the breeze, and in the distance, you can almost hear the echoes of distant cheering. Ah yes, the Olympic Games. Yep, those Olympics. The original ones. The kind with no medals, no sponsorships, and way more olive oil than you'd expect. Every 4 years, people from all over the Greek world came to Olympia to take part in what started as a sacred festival, and slowly evolved into a combination of sports, rituals, and I'm not saying Sparta cheats, but you wander toward the ancient stadium. There's no marble seating here, just grassy slopes where thousands sat, yelled, and occasionally passed out from sunstroke. The track is still faintly visible, long and flat and deceptively narrow. You picture the sprinters, oiled up, barefoot, determined, and yes, very, very naked. Welcome to ancient athletics. But here's the thing. The games weren't just about sport. They were about honor, about proving your body and mind were worthy in front of the gods. And at the center of all this spiritual flexing, Zeus, always Zeus. Victors didn't get cash prizes or endorsement deals. They got a crown made of wild olive branches and eternal bragging rights. And maybe, if they were lucky, a statue near the Templier, a poem written about them that mostly exaggerated everything. And still, they came. City-states who usually couldn't agree on what counted as bread would send athletes to compete under one unspoken rule: no war during the games. Like, literal ceasefire. Historians still argue about how well this Olympic truce worked. Some say it was widely respected. Others think it was more of a suggestion than a rule. But the idea itself? Noble, beautiful, almost modern. Back in the present, you pass what remains of the altar of Zeus, just a shadow of what once was. But in its heyday, this spot saw hundreds of animals sacrificed in honor of the god. Cows, goats, maybe the occasional pig. All as a very smoky, very intense way of saying, hey Zeus, we're still cool, right? You pose. A statue, a stadium, an altar. It hits you. This wasn't just about building pretty things, it was about building meaning. The Greeks poured their beliefs, sweat, fears, and hopes into this valley, into the games, into the god who, from his golden throne inside the temple, watched it all. You head back toward the temple, the ground warm beneath your feet. This place isn't frozen in time, it's layered. It smells like ash, victory, sun-warmed stone, and distant thunder. And as the breeze curls around your face, you realize something else. You've just walked the same path countless others walked before you: athletes, poets, kings, philosophers, and people with sore legs just like yours. And all of them, at some point, looked up at Zeus and thought, wow, so that's what divine looks like. You sit on a low stone wall just outside the temple, brushing a bit of dust from your tunicore. You know, your imagination's version of one. The late afternoon sun paints everything in golden light, and for a moment, it feels like time has stopped. But don't get too cozy yet, because now, it's time to talk about how Zeus's statue almost didn't happen at all. You see, the ancient Greeks didn't just wake up one morning and decide, let's build a 40-foot tall thunder daddy out of ivory and gold. This wasn't an impulse buy. Before Phidias even picked up a chisel, there were problems. Funding problems. Political problems. Are we really doing this in the middle of a war? Problems. You overhear some ancient gossip. Local priests arguing with city officials. Merchants debating whether sponsoring a toe of Zeus counts as good PR. Turns out, building a literal miracle costs a lot. Ivory had to be imported probably from as far away as Egypt or India, and gold, well, that's never been cheap. And let's not even start on the labor. You're not just hiring a few sculptors. You need metalworkers, carpenters, ivory specialists, architects, bronze casters, and at least one very patient accountant. Probably two. Plus, you had to keep it all secret enough that rival cities wouldn't swoop in with their own bigger, shinier god statues. Imagine the arms race if Sparta heard Olympia was getting fancy, but eventually, after years of negotiation, some brilliant lobbying, and no doubt a suspiciously large number of donations, the green light was given. Phidias moved to Olympia, not just for the project, but to live near it. He even set up his own workshop nearby. And, fun fact, you can still visit the remains of that building today. Imagine walking into a dusty stone ruin and realizing, oh wow, this is where they built Zeus's kneecaps. Here's a weird detail. Phidias didn't just start carving randomly. He reportedly ran small experiments, first test pieces in clay or bronze to work out the proportions. He even tested how light would bounce off the gold at different times of day. Artists, man, never not dramatic. And then there's the religion part. Every step had to follow sacred rituals. The statue wasn't just art, it was a vessel for the divine. Every material had to be ritually purified, every tool blessed, every movement inside the temple governed by strict religious codes. One misstep, and people might interpret it as an omen. A sneeze during assembly? Yikes. Someone dropped a hammer during prayer? Better hope the gods weren't paying attention. Even today, scholars argue about whether Phidias truly believed in Zeus, or whether he was just a genius playing to the crowd. Some say he was deeply devout. Others think he was more of a spiritual freelancer, respectful but pragmatic. Still others believe he was just in it for the legacy. And wow, did he ever get one? You glance up at the temple again, imagining the moment when the statue was finally revealed. Picture the crowds pushing forward, wide-eyed, priests lighting incense, poets scribbling half-finished verses on parchment, some guy in the back crying but insisting it's allergies. The unveiling wasn't just a ta-da moment. It was a ceremony, a cosmic alignment of craftsmanship, belief, and stage lighting, well, torchlight. And in that instant, something changed not just in Olympia, but across the entire Greek world. Zeus was no longer just a myth in the sky. He had a face, a presence, and the people, they finally had something tangible to anchor their awe. You take a slow breath, like you're still smelling the warm resin from ancient incense burners. Around you, the shadows grow longer. The day is ending, but the statue, it's just beginning its legend. And deep inside the temple, that golden gaze never blinks. You stretch your legs a little, walking through ancient Olympia, even in your imagination, is no small task. And now, it's time to go back inside to look, once more, into the eyes of Zeus. Except this time, you're not just admiring his shine, you're here to decode him. Because, let's be honest, this statue isn't just a pretty face, every detail is a symbol, and every symbol is a message. Like one giant, glittering puzzle of divine propaganda. Start at the obvious. Zeus's throne. It's not some simple wooden chair you drag in from the corner. No, this thing is a masterpiece in its own right. Crafted from cedar wood, inlaid with ebony, ivory, gold, and precious stones, the throne alone could probably fund a small army. Carved into its arms and legs, mythological scenes, creatures, battles, gods and monsters, tangled in eternal motion. You don't just sit on this thing, you ascend into narrative itself. Historians think it was designed to remind visitors that Zeus isn't just a god, he's the god, the one who rules over the entire Greek mythological canon like a benevolent but slightly terrifying CEO. You look closer. In Zeus's right hand, a statue of Nike, the winged goddess of victory. She stands delicately on his palm like a glowing chess piece. Some say she was made entirely of ivory and gold, her wings spread wide, always just about to fly but never quite taking off. Why victory? Well, it's a flex. Zeus isn't just powerful, he hands out power. If you win a war, or a race, or even just a very complicated family argument, it's because Zeus let you. In his left hand, a scepter, tall and straight, topped with an eagle. The eagle isn't random, this was Zeus's sacred animal, the one that always shows up when the gods are about to drop the hammer. It's basically the divine version of I'm watching you. Even Zeus's clothing says something. His robe glows gold, embroidered with lilies and mythical animalzians, griffins, maybe a sphinx or two hiding in the folds. This isn't fashion, it's a reminder. Zeus doesn't wear mortal things, he wears the world. You might notice something else, know his expression. It's calm, strangely calm, not angry or judging. His eyes don't scream smite now so much as whisper, I've already decided. It's unnerving, but also comforting, like being told your fate by someone who doesn't need to raise his voice. There's a Greek word for this expression, simnos. It means noble, dignified, filled with divine gravity. It's the look of a god who knows everything and doesn't need to explain anything. And here's the coolest part. The entire statue was designed for perspective. If you stood too close, Zeus looked too big. If you stood too far, he seemed to shrink. But when you stood in the exact center of the temple floor, bam, perfect symmetry. The lighting, the angles, the proportions, they all clicked. It was like the statue and the room were in on a secret together. Some historians think Phidias even placed gold tiles in the floor to reflect light upward, making the statue shimmer as if lit from within. Others think that's wishful thinking. Scholars love arguing about this. Was the shimmer real or imagined? Who knows? You kind of like the mystery. And yet, with all this meaning packed into every square inch of ivory and gold, one question lingers. Was this statue meant to be seen or believed in? That's the beauty of it. To some, it was a marvel of art. To others, a portal to the divine, To many, it was both. And you stand there, breathing the warm air of Olympia, and for a split second, it feels like you're in the middle of something bigger than yourself. Not in a spooky way, just in that soft, ancient way where the world used to feel full of stories, and every stone had a soul. Your gaze drifts up again, settling on the serene, impossible face of Zeus. Yeah, he's still looking just over your head, and somehow, that feels exactly right. You step outside again, letting the warm breeze carry away the weight of all that golden grandeur. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the crumbled stones of Olympia. And just when you think the amazement might be over, you catch sight of something tucked away behind the temple. A humble rune. Overgrown. Quiet. Phidias' workshop. Yep, that same Phidias. The artist behind one of the greatest wonders of the world had his little base camp right here. You imagine him wiping sweat off his brow, tossing scraps of ivory to the side, muttering to himself about the math behind a divine earlobe. This wasn't just a workshop. It was more like a divine laboratory. And the best part? We actually found it. Centuries later, archaeologists unearthed tools, molds, remnants of gold leafall in this very spot. And in a twist that feels too good to be true, they even found a cup. A simple little cup, with a name scratched into the bottom. Phi-4, I-4, Pu-3, Yone, Long, 2, Yuon, Ta-3, D2, Er-3, Ta-3, Awon, Er-3, Fa-3s, Phidias. Now, some scholars naturally argue it could have belonged to someone else named Phidias, like a Phidias Jr., or a very ambitious intern. But come on, what are the odds another guy named Phidias just happened to leave his coffee mug in the exact spot where ancient records said the Phidias lived and worked? This place tells a different story than the temple. It's not majestic or overwhelming, it's human. You can almost see the team of artisans here, bustling around the base of a half-finished Zeus leg, mixing glues, carving ivory plates, checking blueprints, arguing over whether the eagle wings should tilt left or right. One guy probably just brought snacks. Another might have been solely responsible for Zeus's pinky toe. And Phidias himself, maybe not so glamorous in person. Imagine a brilliant, stressed out man covered in gold dust, muttering formulas under his breath, swatting flies, and occasionally staring off into the distance like he just saw the cosmos. You peek inside the remains of the workshop, and it feels like stepping into a forgotten brain. Brick outlines trace where the walls once stood, tools rusted into the soil like whispers. And the biggest surprise? A large pit in the floor. Turns out, it wasn't a wine cellar. That pit was part of the casting process, a place to work with bronze or test out fire-resistant materials. Basically, ancient industrial science. This was where the magic happened, but not the kind with wands or potions. This was precision, planning, art meets engineering. And honestly, it makes the statue feel even more miraculous. Because now you know, it didn't appear out of nowhere. It took years, hundreds of hands, mistakes, revisions, delays. Imagine the anxiety of sculpting a divine figure out of elephant tusks and hoping the humidity doesn't ruin the whole thing. And yet, they pulled it off. You sit for a moment on a stone ledge, letting the quiet settle in. There's no grandeur here, just the echo of people trying their best to create something bigger than themselves. It's comforting, in a way, because behind every great wonder, there's a workshop. Behind every god, a craftsman, and behind every legend, a cup with someone's name scratched into the bottom. You smile. Turns out even history's greatest artists needed a break and a good drink. Back inside the temple again, the air feels different, like you've crossed some invisible line between just visiting and fully immersed. Maybe it's the scent of incense clinging to the stone, or maybe it's the flickering torchlight playing tricks on your imagination. Either way, something's changed. And now you're wondering, what was it like to actually be here? Not just as a time-traveling tourist like you, but as a real ancient pilgrim? Let's rewind your sandals a bit. Imagine you've traveled for days, maybe even weeks, through hills, valleys, dusty roads. You've got calluses, a slightly sore back, and a very determined sense of purpose. You're coming to Olympia not just to see Zeus, but to meet him. Kind of like lining up to see a rock star, except you bring an animal sacrifice instead of a poster. The first thing you notice? The crowds. Every 4 years, people flooded into Olympia for the games, yes. Those Olympic games. Athletes, priests, vendors, poets, philosophers, pickpockets, fortune tellers, all packed together under the Greek sun, covered in olive oil and ambition. And smack in the middle of it all, the Temple of Zeus. Stepping inside wasn't a casual thing. This was a sacred ritual. You'd purify yourself first, probably with water and maybe even a small sacrifice. Then you'd enter the temple barefoot, your footsteps echoing against the marble floor, heart thumping like a war drum. And then, boom, there he is, Zeus, towering above you, glistening, glowing, watching. Your knees might actually go a little weak. Some ancient writers claim visitors were struck speechless. Others say they wept or fainted. One Roman historian said the statue was so powerful, it made you forget that you were merely mortal. Drama? Sure, but maybe not an exaggeration. Because this wasn't just a statue, it was an experience. There was music, sometimes flutes playing slow, spiraling notes, priests chanting prayers, the soft hiss of incense smoke curling up toward Zeus's feet, candles flickering, whispered wishes in every direction. It was basically divine ASMR. And don't forget, you weren't alone. This was a shared moment. Hundreds of people inside the same room, hearts thudding, mouths slightly open, staring up together into the impossible. Some were here to give thanks. Some to pray for victory in battle or the arena. Some just to say, "Hey Zeus, remember me?" And you know what? That collective reverence, it kind of amplified everything. Like the statue wasn't just feeding on gold and ivory yet, it was feeding on awe. There's this one weird theory, of course there is, that the statue may have had subtle mechanisms inside, maybe joints or compartments that made it feel alive. Nothing as dramatic as moving arms, but little touches. Sparkles, reflections. Rumors even swirled that Zeus would smile at you if you stood at the right angle. Creepy? A little? Impressive? Definitely. But whether the statue moved or not, the truth is, your mind filled in the rest. Because that's what humans do. We see light on gold, hear a flute in the distance, feel the chill of marble on our feet, and suddenly, we're standing face to face with a god. You leave the temple slowly, feet dragging a little, like waking up from a dream you don't want to end. And as you step back into the daylight, blinking at the real world, you think, no wonder people crossed entire countries just to be here. This wasn't just a visit. It was a moment carved into memory, one you'd carry for the rest of your life. You wake up early the next day, still in Olympia, still under that ancient sky, and decide it's time to look beyond the statue itself. Because as glorious as Zeus was inside his marble throne room, the story doesn't stop there. This isn't just about one god in one place. It's about an entire world that revolved around him. So you do what any curious traveler would do. You wander. Olympia, in its prime, wasn't just a holy site. It was a full-blown cultural theme park. The Temple of Zeus was the headliner, sure, but the whole area was packed with shrines, gymnasiums, racetracks, training halls, baths, and yes, even pop-up food stands. Okay, maybe not exactly pop-up, but you get the idea. And Zeus? He was everywhere. You spot him on coins, on pillars, on weathered statues half swallowed by ivy. Even the river had his name tied to it. It's like Olympus outsourced the whole brand to this one town. Then your feet lead you to something unexpected. The Altis. That's the sacred grove at the heart of Olympia. Trees thick with age, birds chirping like they're auditioning for a role in a myth. This was the place where worship began long before the grand temples and golden statues. You stand among the olive trees, and it's quiet in a way that feels ancient. Like even the breeze knows it shouldn't interrupt. Here's a cool little secret. Those Olympic wreaths, the ones placed on the heads of victorious athletes, they were made from branches taken from a specific wild olive tree in this very grove. That's right, no gold medals, no endorsement deals, just a branch from Zeus's personal garden. And people fought hard for it. Why? Because victory wasn't about wealth, it was about divine favor. If you won in Olympia, It meant Zeus himself had smiled upon you. And if you lost, well, maybe you should have prayed harder. You wander past what remains of the Philippeion, a round building funded by Philip II of Macedonius. That's Alexander the Great's dad. It's the only structure inside the Altus that was dedicated to mortal humans, not gods. Bit awkward, right? Putting your family shrine right next to Zeus's temple? Classic power move? And oh, the Olympic Games. They weren't just a sporting event. They were a religious festival, a political summit, and a social mixer all rolled into one. Athletes competed nudies, completely nudies, which makes things like discus and wrestling a whole lot more high stakes than we usually imagine. And the entire event was dedicated to Zeus. Winning meant glory, but it also meant you were part of something eternal. Even today, the modern Olympic flame is lit right here in Olympia before traveling across the globe. That little flicker of fire, it's a direct line to this sacred place. You lean on a fallen column and try to picture it all. The cheers, the sweat, the hymns echoing across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a priest makes a sacrifice. A victor stumbles out of the stadium, olive wreath in hand, tears in his eyes. And overhead, the faint shimmer of Zeus's statue, towering in his temple, watching everything with that serene, knowing gaze. You begin to see it now. This wasn't just a religious hub or a sports arena. Olympia was a heartbeat, a place where humans and gods brushed shoulders, where myth and muscle collided, where a statue wasn't just a statue but the anchor of an entire civilization's soul. You take one last look around, and suddenly, even the ruins seem alive. You take a deep breath and wander toward the outskirts of Olympia, where the city's noise softens, and the real stories begin to whisper. Because behind every wonder, there's a history that isn't all gold and glory. There's politics, rivalries, drama, and boy, did the Temple of Zeus have its share. First off, did you know that even ancient Greeks had building politics? You'd think a temple dedicated to the king of the gods would get universal love and support. Nope, local city-states squabbled over funding, prestige, and control. Olympia itself was run by the Eleans, but they constantly faced pushback from neighboring cities like Pisa and Elis. Those cities wanted a piece of the action and the honor that came with hosting the Olympic Games. At times, the Olympic festival nearly got canceled because of these feuds. Imagine that no Olympics because a few towns couldn't get along. Sounds eerily familiar, huh? And here's a juicy tidbit. The architect who designed the Temple of Zeus was named Liban of Elis, but some ancient sources claim that others helped design parts of it, sparking debates that still confuse historians today. Like who really deserves credit for building one of the 7 wonders? Ancient Facebook drama. Speaking of drama, the statue itself wasn't immune. Phidias, the master sculptor, was once accused of stealing gold intended for the statue's creation. There was even a trial, but the charges never stuck. Some say it was political sabotage. Others think Phidias just annoyed the wrong people by being too talented. Either way, it's wild to imagine one of the most revered artists in history having to defend his integrity like a soap opera star. And let's not forget the debates among scholars. There's a big question mark hanging over how the statue actually looked. Did Zeus wear sandals or go barefoot? Were the gold details pure gold leaf or a different technique? Was the statue exactly 12 meters tall or slightly taller? Some experts argue over these tiny details like a bunch of ancient Instagram influencers debating filters. You shake your head and chuckle. These arguments don't detract from the wonder, they add flavor. Because history isn't just facts, it's a living conversation. And every generation adds its own voice. As you stroll past the broken pillars and scattered marble, you realize that the Temple of Zeus isn't just a monument frozen in time. It's a reminder that even the greatest achievements come with a side of human messy arguments, accusations, rivalries, and endless debates. And that's okay, because without that, history would be pretty boring. And honestly, a bit too perfect. So you keep walking, letting the stories settle around you like the dust on the ancient stones. And somewhere deep inside, you feel the pulse of it all, the triumph and the trouble, the glory and the gossip. That's the real magic. The sun is dipping lower again, and you find yourself wandering near the remains of the ancient workshop once more. This time, curiosity pulls you deeper into the tools and fragments left behind, remnants of that magical, messy process of creation. You notice something strange. There's evidence that the workshop wasn't just for carving ivory and gilding gold. Nope. It also served as a mini laboratory for experimenting with new techniques like mixing different resins or trying out fireproof coatings. You imagine Phidias hunched over a bench, squinting at a tiny vial, muttering something like, "If this dries too fast, the whole thing might crumble again." It's a reminder that the statue wasn't just an art project. It was engineering on a divine scale, and that meant constant trial and error. Some ancient texts suggest that Phidias and his team might have used a kind of early blueprint system, sketching designs on parchment and maybe even using small-scale models. Pretty high-tech for 5th century BCE Greece. There's also a quirky little fact that's not often mentioned. Some believe the statue had a built-in scent diffuser. That's right. The temple may have been filled with the aroma of myrrh and frankincense, wafting gently from small hidden containers around the statue. Whether it's true or just a wild rumor, it adds another layer to the sensory experience, making the visit to Zeus not only a feast for the eyes, but for the nose, too. And here's where things get even trickier. The statue was made of chrysolephantin ivory and gold over a wooden frame, which sounds amazing until you remember that wood rots, ivory yellows, and gold, well, can be stolen. Historians and archaeologists are still debating exactly how the statue was preserved and maintained over the centuries. Some suggest that special rituals involved re-gilding the statue regularly. Others believe that it was kept behind locked doors most of the time, only revealed during important ceremonies. Whatever the truth, it's clear that maintaining such a colossal masterpiece was a massive, ongoing effort. And, of course, there are whispers about how it actually disappeared. The statue vanished sometime during the later Roman Empire, but no one knows exactly when or how. Was it destroyed in a fire, looted by invading forces, secretly dismantled and sold piece by piece? Scholars still argue fiercely about its fate because, unlike the pyramids or the Parthenon, no definitive ruins remain. It's like the statue slipped through history's fingers. You can almost feel the weight of that mystery hanging in the air. After all, the greatest wonders aren't always eternal. Sometimes they're just moments, brilliant flashes of human creativity that vanish before we can fully grasp them. You take one last look at the ruins, your mind swirling with awe and questions. And maybe, just maybe, that's part of the magic too. As night begins to settle over Olympia again, you find yourself back near the temple ruins. But this time, your thoughts drift to the people who actually built this wonder. You might think the gods got all the credit, but behind the glimmering gold and polished ivory were hundreds, maybe thousands soft-skilled workers. These weren't just slaves chained to their chisels either. Many were artisans, carpenters, ivory carvers, and goldsmiths who had mastered their crafts over years, sometimes decades. They were the unsung heroes behind the scenes, the hands that turned raw materials into divine beauty. And here's a fun fact. The ivory used for the statue probably came from elephant tusks imported from as far as India or North Africa. That means there was an entire ancient trade network dedicated to supplying materials for one statue. Imagine the logistics: a caravan of traders, sailors, and merchants working together just to get the ivory to Olympia. Yet, despite the grandeur, these workers lived ordinary lives. They probably joked, argued, and complained about the heat, just like you might after a long day. Maybe they even had secret nicknames for Zeus or the famous sculptor Phidias' ancient workplace banter we'll never hear. What's fascinating is that Phidias wasn't just an artist. He was also a manager, overseeing dozens of workers, balancing budgets, and dealing with temperamental patrons. The pressure must have been enormous. And historians still debate whether Phidias actually completed the statue himself or just designed it, leaving the bulk of the hands-on work to his apprentices. It's a question that echoes through the centuries. How much of a masterpiece is the vision of one man, and how much is the collective effort of many? You imagine the workshop bustling with life tools clinking, sawdust in the air, voices raised in excitement or frustration. It's a reminder that great art rarely comes from solitude. It's a symphony of many voices working in harmony. And that brings you back to the present moment. Standing alone in the ruins, hearing echoes of those ancient conversations carried on the wind, a little messy, a little chaotic, but ultimately brilliant. You wake up to the soft glow of dawn and decide to explore the religious rituals tied to the statue. Because worshiping Zeus wasn't just about standing in awe, it was an active, communal experience packed with ceremonies, prayers, and yes, a fair bit of drama. One of the most important rituals involved animal sacrifices, usually bulls or goats. You might be imagining some wild theatrical bloodbath, but ancient Greeks approached this with solemn respect. The animals were led quietly to the altar, and the priests recited hymns as smoke curled upwards. It was less Game of Thrones and more meditation with a side of barbecue. Interestingly, scholars still debate whether the sacrifices were primarily symbolic offerings or if they also served a social function like redistributing meat to the community. So next time you hear about sacrifices, remember, it was as much about feeding the people as feeding the gods. After the sacrifices, there were grand processions. Imagine hundreds of worshippers, draped in white robes, moving slowly through olive groves, carrying wreaths and offerings. The air would be thick with incense and the murmur of chants. It was a feast for all senses, designed to make you feel part of something bigger. One quirky little tradition involved athletes anointing themselves with olive oil before competing, a practice thought to honor Zeus's strength and agility. Plus, it probably made them look cooler. Athletes looking good? Some things never change. You realize these rituals weren't just religious duties, they were social glue, binding communities and generations together. Even today, echoes of these practices survive. The Olympic flame lighting ceremony, for example, is a symbolic continuation of honoring Zeus's spirit. Though the exact rituals have changed, the heart of the tradition beats on. You close your eyes and picture the scene, firelight flickering against ancient marble, voices rising in song, the scent of burning herbs mixing with the crisp morning air. It's a ritual that transcends time, and as you breathe it in, you feel the powerful pulse of human faith, flawed, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating. Night falls again, and you find yourself thinking about the legacy of the statue, how something so magnificent influenced art, culture, and even politics long after it disappeared. The sheer scale of the statue was like a giant billboard screaming, "This is what divine power looks like." Kings, emperors, and artists across the ancient world looked up to it for inspiration. Roman emperors even tried to imitate the statue's grandeur in their own sculptures, hoping some of Zeus's thunder would rub off on them. But here's a lesser-known tidbit. Some ancient coins and smaller statues were actually modeled on the Olympian Zeus, spreading his image far beyond Olympia. These little replicas helped spread the cult of Zeus and reinforce his status as king of the god seven to places that never saw the big statue in person. Of course, the statue's influence wasn't just about size and gold. It changed the way artists thought about human form and divine presence. Phidias's work set a standard for combining naturalism with idealism, a balance that's still debated in art history classes today. And there's a debate among scholars about how much this idealism shaped Greek identity itself. Did the statue help define what it meant to be Greek? Did it embody values like strength, wisdom, and justice? Or was it simply a divine ego boost? Whatever the answer, one thing's clear. The statue left a footprint on history bigger than its marble base. You sit quietly, imagining artists centuries later sketching Zeus's pose, trying to capture that mix of calm authority and immense power. And as you do, you realize that true wonders don't just vanish, they echo. They ripple through time, shaping stories, beliefs, and dreams, even in silence. The moon is high now, and you decide to linger by the remains of the temple, pondering the myths and stories that wove themselves around the statue over centuries. Because Zeus wasn't just a god on a throne. He was a character in countless tales that shaped ancient Greek culture and still sneak into ours today. You remember that Zeus was famous for his thunderbolt, but did you know he also had a pet eagle? The eagle was seen as his messenger and symbol of his power. Some stories say the eagle carried Zeus's thunderbolt across the skies, which adds a pretty cool mythical delivery service vibe. But here's the kicker. Historians still debate how much these myths influenced the statue's design. Was Phidias inspired by specific stories, or was he creating an idealized, almost abstract vision of divinity? It's like trying to guess an artist's playlist before they start painting. And those myths, they were messy. Zeus had a reputation for, well, complicated relationships with both gods and mortals. But none of that scandal made it onto the statue. Phidias gave Zeus a calm, majestic presence, like the ultimate dad who's seen it all but still commands respect. You can almost hear the whispers of ancient storytellers spinning tales by firelight, some making Zeus larger than life, others poking fun at his flaws. These stories were part history, part entertainment, and part morality lessons all woven together like a giant Greek soap opera. It's this blend of myth and reality that makes the statue so fascinating. It's not just stone and gold. It's a symbol of a culture wrestling with ideas about power, justice, and humanity. And as you stand there, bathed in moonlight, you feel the weight of those stories pressing gently on your soul, like an ancient lullaby reminding you that even gods have stories to tell. The first light of dawn sneaks through the olive trees as you find yourself reflecting on the mysterious disappearance of the statue and the temple. It's strange to think that something so monumental, so admired for centuries, could just vanish, leaving behind only stories and scattered ruins. You learn that the temple and statue likely faced their end during a series of earthquakes and possibly fires, but there's no clear record of exactly what happened. Some scholars argue it was destroyed in the 5th century AD, others suggest it survived longer. This uncertainty has historians debating to this day classic case of history's missing puzzle piece. What's truly fascinating is how the statue's disappearance sparked a kind of cultural nostalgia even back then. Ancient writers lamented the loss, comparing it to losing a part of Greece's soul. It's like when you lose your favorite childhood toy and realize it held more meaning than you thought. You also discover that parts of the statue gold and ivory fragments might have been looted or repurposed in other works, scattered across the Roman Empire. Imagine bits of Zeus's glory hidden away in unknown corners of ancient villas, or melted down and reforged into something new. And here's a cool but lesser known fact. Some believe that the statue's memory influenced Christian iconography of Christ as the King of Kings, blending old and new symbols of divine authority. Scholars still debate this connection, but it shows how powerful images can transcend cultures and religions. You take a deep breath, feeling the weight of centuries fade into the gentle morning light. You've traveled through time, witnessed glory, drama, art, and mystery. And now, as the world awakens around you, you carry a piece of that wonder with you. A quiet reminder that even the greatest wonders have stories beyond the stones. Now, as your eyes grow heavy and your mind slows, let the whispers of ancient Olympia lull you into rest. Imagine the soft rustle of olive leaves, the distant murmur of priests' prayers, the gentle glow of a fire fading into embers. You are wrapped in a calm that stretches across time and space, where gods and mortals breathe in the same quiet night. No hurry, no noise, just the steady rhythm of your own breath. Rest now, knowing that wonders live in stories, and stories live in dreams. Good night, dear traveler.